There's Devon Murugan joining us. So, Devon, now that the mask mandate has been lifted, can we just sort of saunter into the office with no mask and say, I don't have to because the health minister says?
Yeah. And I think one or two of those instances may have happened today, just given the fact
I know my son tried it at school today.
Indeed. But I tell you what, let's get some legal clarity on that. Associate at Cliffe Dekker Hofmeyr, Abigail Butcher joins us now to get some insights on that particular issue, Sally. Abigail, thanks very much indeed for talking to us. I mean, is it as simple as that? Do the national rules override that of the workplace, or does it not?
Thank you very much for having me. So we've also had a very interesting day. A lot of people saying, well, do we take our masks off, don't we? But the interesting thing is it's not necessarily that the national legislation overrides anything. It's that there's still a piece of national legislation or regulation, shall I say, that speak to reduction in transmission through the use of respiratory equipment, respiratory protective equipment. So notwithstanding 16A to C of the regulations being repealed today, there's still a piece of regulation that's in place called the Hazardous Biological Agents Regulations. And what that does is it says COVID-19 is a class 3, let's call it HBA, for speed purposes. It's a class 3 HBA, which means that there's a risk of transmission, but there are forms of prophylaxis like vaccination and treatment available. What it says in relation to class 3 HBAs is that employers still have an obligation to conduct risk assessments, and off the basis of those risk assessments, two primary obligations arise. The first is to train, inform, and interestingly instruct employees on the measures that are used to reduce transmission in the workplace. The second is that employers must use whatever means possible, so including respiratory protective equipment, to reduce transmission. So in an instance where an employer has identified a higher risk environment, so it doesn't necessarily have to be across the workplace. It can be specific divisions of the workplace, but where a high risk area has been identified, the employer is still entitled under its obligations under the HBA regulations to say that the wearing of respiratory protective equipment, so masks, is in fact necessary to reduce the risk of transmission. So the short answer, there's no strict legislative provision in relation to mask wearing. The long answer, employers still have obligations under the Occupational Health and Safety Act and the HBA regulations to whatever extent possible, reduce the transmission of COVID in workplaces.
Because on the other side of the spectrum, and presumably you will still have many employees themselves not comfortable unmasking. So that's another position to consider, isn't it?
100%. And obviously there's nothing precluding an individual from continuing to wear masks. And I think what's interesting about the HBA regulations is it speaks to the use of respiratory protective equipment as a may. So you may use respiratory protective equipment. So it's not the only measure that you can use to reduce transmission. So I understand it's an interesting legal point, but it depends. If an employer can reduce the risk of transmission through the use of various other measures, like sanitizing, social distancing, sufficient ventilation, it may well be the case that masks are not necessary. So, for example, an outdoor gathering where there's sufficient ventilation and sufficient distancing may not call for the wearing of masks for the reduction in the risk of transmission. So there's a bit of discretion involved there for individuals wanting to wear a mask and employers assessing what the best route is to reduce transmission.
And if I can extend this, Abigail, and certainly I know this is not part of your ambit here, but I mean, you would have had parents waking up this morning and saying, well, what do I do with the kids as they set off to school? And one of the SMSs I received earlier was that the GDE, the Gauteng Department of Education, will still have to sort of, set the standard for schools there. So I would imagine that, they're the overriding authority there. It's a very similar case, isn't it?
100%. And I would say that the reduction in transmission always needs to be the primary concern. So notwithstanding no strict legislative provision, and as well as the fact that we're seeing COVID-19 manifest in different ways than we did originally, and perhaps in lesser risky ways, that it's always the obligation, I think, of an employer, and specifically of a school, definitely as a custodian of children, to really assess risk of transmission and use their discretion to reduce transmission through whatever means possible, whether that applies to masks or the various other techniques that we've discussed, then that's the discretion that they'll need to utilize.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Well, thanks very much indeed. Abigail Butcher is an associate at Cliffe Dekker Hofmeyr for those.